Counsel, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT, and welcome to today's Chicago Tonight Voices, a WTTW News community conversation exploring Chicago's art scene. This special Voices conversation is part of WTTW News and Chicago Tonight's coverage of the arts. WTTW is committed to producing and presenting trusted best-in-class content fueled by distinctly Chicago sensibility. We have served as Chicago's window to the world, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Art is everywhere in Chicago, in your neighborhood, or just a few L stops away, at museums, community centers, parks, and gardens. Today's conversation will provide an opportunity to connect with the art and the artists that shape and reflect the life of the city. Funding for WTTW art coverage as part of Art Design Chicago, a citywide collaboration highlighting the city's artistic heritage and creative communities, is provided in part by the Terra Foundation for American Art. The generous support of donors, sponsors, and WTTW members and viewers like you make it possible for WTTW to bring provocative ideas to life, to tackle the issues that matter, and to expand our perspectives on the world in which we live. There's only one reason why this is possible, and the reason is you. Thank you for your support. Now please welcome our host, Marc Vitali, JCS Fund for DuPage Foundation Arts Correspondent, WTTW News. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Hi. Greetings to our viewers and listeners joining in. Reminder that this is in listen-only mode, but you can ask questions in the chat. And I would like to welcome our guests, Janine Mileaf, Executive Director and Curator of the Arts Club in Chicago. That is a historically important private club with public shows that has exposed Chicagoans to new artists and vice versa for more than a century. Then we have Faheem Majeed, artist, curator, multi-hyphenate, founder of the arts collective Floating Museum, former director of the historic Southside Community Arts Center. I could go on, but on to Lara, director of the DePaul Art Museum. I could go on there too, but let's just dig into it if we may. Thanks everybody for joining us, much appreciated. And I want to start with a big question, the big topic. Are there themes that emerge over the years in Chicago's arts landscape? I mean, as I look at it, yes, there are art movements, but perhaps maybe more important, there's autonomy, there's individualism. Is that fair to say? Am I on the right track?
Yeah.
Chime in, yes. Yeah?
I think there has been a sort of interest in Chicago in the documentary in some ways, and in work that is depictive rather than abstract. That's a theme, and that is a sort of kind of going against the mainstream of the sort of art world. This is in the mid-20th century, I'm thinking. And I think that documentary, it also goes into the way that people kind of approach things, like they want to have a story maybe. And that may be a kind of some overarching idea.
Yeah, because when I think of mid-century art, I usually think of abstract expressionism. When I think of Chicago mid-century art, I'm thinking, I don't know, H.C. Westerman or, Gertrude Abercrombie, Edgar Miller, people who don't fit that at all.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, how has the city distinguished itself from the coasts? Bucking trends, as I just said, or, maybe perhaps blazing a parallel trail where you have imagists, Harry Hu, and pop art happening that are similar but not quite the same. Not exactly the same.
I think so much of it, Mark, and this also goes back to your sort of question about individualism with individual artists being the focus. I think it also has to do with how we tend to talk about ourselves. Chicago, has always had sort of this chip on our shoulder of being the second city and comparing ourselves to New York or LA, particularly in terms of its arts and culture. But honestly, I think one of the things that really distinguishes us is the community aspect. And I've, from the curators that we've worked with to the artists that we've shown to the artists that we've been in such close contact with, anybody that works here and then leaves or has come from another place has really talked about the fact that community in Chicago is very different and so much more supportive than you might get on the East or West Coast. I think part of that comes from our kind of grassroots, pull yourself up by your bootstrings sort of mentality that we've got in Chicago, that it's this really kind of hardworking city, and that the artists working within it and are really involved in sort of helping to support each other in order to tell Chicago's story, so that I think it's less maybe about the individual, although historically that's certainly how we've talked about it. But I think instead, if you really do to dig deep, most of those individuals that we kind of spotlight are really pulling from the environments and the communities and the people that they are working with and building with.
Faheem, I'm thinking of the last time I interviewed you. You had curated a show at Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art, and like how does that fit in the importance of self-taught artists, outsider artists? The power of one voice and one vision that's unlike anything we might have seen.
Right. You can't take art and put it into kind of an isolated box, right? Art responds to its environment, right? So you talk about Second City, you talk about bootstrapping, how we respond to things or how we're trained to respond to things, whether intuitive, being self-taught, this is kind of ability just to kind of make something. It's just how it engages with the city. So you can't talk about art without talking to the city, because the art responds to the city. And art education was all from Chicago, working through a community organization. But what I began to learn is our teaching institutions are very, very important. And I always talk about Chicago's ability to just start something. We don't have a massive, our gallery scene is not the same as in LA or New York, but we have lots and lots and lots of talented artists looking for opportunities. So oftentimes they end up making space. So it's oftentimes, unfortunately or fortunately, not enough to be just an artist, but you also have to kind of like found a platform, right? So a lot of the things we kind of heralded are both the artists making the thing, but also making the pedestal or the platform of which they show on that thing. Now, once again, that's not unusual. There's lots of pop-up galleries and garage things and interesting things all over the world. But what's unique about Chicago is you can open up a gallery in your garage, have a great concept or a great movement, and you'll have our institutions, leaders, and curators at that garage the first week. Now, that's unusual. That shows a sign of ecology, respect, and understanding of a culture as well. So it's just kind of how we get things done and how things are respected. I didn't understand how unique that was until I started traveling, talking about those things as if they were common ground, and other people in other spaces all over the world saying, "What are you talking about? That's not how any of that works."
Oh.
So there is something special here.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned the support from the institutions too, because you've all been are tied or have been tied to important institutions, but you go beyond that, and you've got the Newberry Library, the Hyde Park Art Center, the Jury House Museum, the Roger Brown Study Collection, Intuit, as I mentioned. It just goes on. I mean, you start looking at the Harry Who and the Imagist, and all of a sudden you're looking into the Field Museum and Maxwell Street. It's just interesting that the support runs so deep in Chicago and can come from unexpected places. Janine, I fondly remember a show you did at the Arts Club a few years ago and I also happen to have some good video that we shot, so I
Okay.
wanted to roll that. This is a show about surrealism, but I want to talk just, if you could generally tell me about, the Arts Club and what they've introduced to Chicago.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to do that. The Arts Club was founded in 1916, and it was the first institution in the United States to really focus on the art of its time. There were other kind of encyclopedic museums that did show 20th century art. The Art Institute wasn't one of them. And so the Arts Club founders were a bunch of sort of tastemakers, artists, and collectors. And the idea was to bring together a community of makers and consumers, and to give them a place to have a deep conversation and be engaged with things that they wouldn't otherwise be seeing in the city. And so at the time, we really were the only game of contemporary art. Since then, in the 1930s, the Art Institute started showing 20th century art. The MCA was founded after that. And now the Arts Club has a slightly different niche, which is a very particular one that kind of engages with this legacy of modernism and the kinds of artists that we brought to the city for the first time. We held the first Picasso show in the United States that wasn't at a gallery. We held the first Brancusi show. We held, we invited Gertrude Stein to come. We hosted Dubuffet. So these kind of like big name speakers were seen in the city through the Arts Club of Chicago over the course of the 20th century.
And you also have some dedicated space to local artists, and you have tell me about your current show.
Yeah, so currently we have up an artist from, she's based in Berlin and Seoul. Her name is Haegyu Yang, and the exhibition is called Flatworks. And I'll just give myself a second to plug the exhibition, which closes on Friday. So come see it if you can. She's an artist that's known for sort of big, spectacular installations, and this is a slightly more cerebral exhibition of her two-dimensional series that she's been making for 30 years. So that's a very good example of what we do. This is an artist sort of in mid-career. She's not an unknown artist, but it's a project, a kind of ongoing investigation, her more, what she considers at the core of her making that hasn't had an opportunity to be exhibited because people think of her for a different thing. And then that specific work engages in really surprising ways with the history of the Arts Club, in echoes of people like Marcel Duchamp or Joseph Beuys, both of whom came to the Arts Club.
So there's real power in institutions, obviously, to help artists, to inspire artists, to support artists. Faheem, you ran the Southside Community Arts Center for a while, and 2 years ago you returned to create an impression, literally, as you made a life-size rubbing of the space. The way school kids might do rubbing on a tombstone. I don't know if that's the best metaphor, but it's easier to show this than to tell it. So again, we have some video of that. And tell us about that and a little bit about the historic and continued importance of the Southside Community Arts Center. I think the area is up on the cherry picker there. There we go. Love this.
Yeah. So anyone that knows my work will ultimately find breadcrumbs back to this institution, which was, I say I've been here for 20 years. This is the institution that kind of received me when I came. That's the community of which many come through this small kind of space that's about 80 years now, founded out of the WPA. One of the few or the only that's still in the same facilities with the same kind of basic mission of providing support to the community and jobs for artists and training. This is a space that if you sit, the world will come to you. And that's exactly what happened to me when I first came to Chicago. I sat. And over time, I became curator, then executive director, and it greatly impacted my artwork. So I've gone on to make many works as I transitioned from executive director to kind of community member in that way. And founded my own organization through learning what it means to be an administrator of a community organization like the Southside Community Arts Center, which is so expansive but very small. And much of what I said earlier around the lines of kind of bootstrapping, I mean, it's much connected to the Great Migration. You have many young artists starting out in that space, from Charles White, Margaret Burroughs, Gordon Parks, Archibald Motley, and they're all young people. I'm talking like 18 to 24, just starting out, figuring it out. And to this day, they still supply that type of support. Lots of young people come through there trying to connect with their roots, connect with history. And you know, it's a space where you can do that if you sit long enough. So I've taken a lot. I've gained a lot from my relationship with that organization. And a lot of my work kind of points back to it.
I'm glad you mentioned Charles White. For whatever reason, probably because of Kerry James Marshall being his student in Los Angeles, I think of him as LA, but yeah, no. Laura, Caroline, can you tell me, I mean, how does a university museum connect to the greater community? I mean, I'm sure you're focused on faculty and students to a degree, but then to go beyond that. And by the way, if you haven't been to the museum, it's on Fullerton, right off the Red Line, and it's really worth getting to know. DePaul Art Museum, please.
That's right. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, you know, as the DePaul Art Museum, we really see ourselves as being this connecting hub between the city of Chicago and our students, faculty, and staff at the university. And you know, linked to the university, we're a Catholic Vincentian university, but that comes with a very strong social justice focus. And we have really adopted that as part of our museum core values and ethos through our exhibitions and our public programs and our collection. And with that, you know, it means that we are able to really help support and provide a platform for those artists that generally have been marginalized from art spaces and museums like ours. So thinking about women artists, LGBTQ plus artists, artists of colors and various backgrounds, and really thinking about what are the ways that we can use art as a catalyst for having difficult conversations? How can we, because we are directly connected to that next generation, a really civically engaged lifelong learners, how can we be the ones to help foster those conversations, introduce art and culture into those conversations, and help that next generation of students really understand the way that artists are helping to shape our city and vice versa? So we work with a lot of emerging to mid to even established career artists. And part of really what we're doing, like with our current exhibitions, which is an exhibition on an artist named Edgar Miller, who was working in Chicago from 1917 to 1967, who was very much about, you know, kind of bringing various both corporate and bohemian elements from across Chicago all together in the same room. Through his work and his career, but connecting that with 6 contemporary artists and designers, all with links to Chicago working today, and the ways in which they all have really helped us to think about how we shape our concept of home, how our city shapes our concepts of home, and how we build it out. And so, you know, it's really about thinking about that past, but also present, and then the future generations of artists and civically engaged citizens sort of coming in, being able to be in the same room and have conversations through the artwork itself.
I see. I was just going to ask you about Edgar Miller and to talk about him as an artist because we have some video of Edgar's work when we visited a private residence on Wells Street.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. I mean, you know, I often think I've seen it all in Chicago art world, and then I see something else. There's no catching up. But as an excuse to run this lovely video, so people have an idea of how cool this guy was. I mean, he could just create anything. Whether it's you know, a mural or a sculpture or woodwork. So again, we have that video, and I want to see it and hear a little bit more about Edgar's work, just while we look at some really cool pictures.
Sure. Yeah. So, as I'm sure you'll see in the video, Edgar Miller, those that know him really know him through what are called the handmade homes. And this is just sort of a total environment that Edgar Miller worked on, everything from the wood carvings in the rafters to the wallpaper, the stained glass in the windows. All of this was all built by hand. One of the ways that Edgar Miller has historically been talked about as being this really multi-hyphenate artist, that what he didn't know, he taught himself. But one of the things that we're really trying to do through our exhibition, which we, were really generously given the space through the Terra Foundation support, is to really think about who it was that Edgar Miller was working with. No artist works in a vacuum. I think the fact that, Chicago at the time, this was 1917 to 1967, was really, fighting for having this really robust art scene, and Edgar Miller was really big in hoping to bridge that gap. And with that, he was working from artists like Jesus Torres, who we met at the Jane Addams Hull House. He started his own gallery called The House at the End of the Street, where he was bringing in kind of artists and poets and writers and different folks in conversation with each other. The works that he was doing, like I said, often get talked about as Edgar Miller sort of building this whole home on his own, when in fact he was working so closely with so many other folks to help him begin to know and to learn how to do these skills. So I think, like I mentioned before, so much of this is about how we are telling our story and how those stories get kind of perpetuated moving forward. Edgar Miller, no doubt, was an incredible artist, and an incredible, had this amazing ability to really kind of pick up on things very quickly and be able to adopt them really quickly. But I think the fact that he was working in such a supportive and conversational and really community-based city like Chicago allowed him to be able to kind of make some of these moves and build out these environments. So what we've done in the exhibition, obviously we can't recreate those handmade homes in our space, although we tried to think a million different ways about how to do that. But instead, we're really focused on kind of sharing the fragments of Edgar Miller that are around. His history hasn't really been well documented. It's not in sort of one particular archive, although the Edgar Miller Legacy, who we worked very closely with on the exhibition, is an incredible resource for that. But this is about really kind of pulling the pieces that we do know about Edgar Miller and helping to connect him and the other folks that he was working with to the rest of Chicago at that time.
And that exhibition is up through February, or
That's right, February 23rd.
February 23rd. It's still there then. One thing that we often touch upon is, and I don't have numbers to crunch here or anything, but the economical the boost to art by art shows, whether that's Art Expo or Taylor Swift at Soldier Field. I mean, whoever it is, there's big real impact. I just like to bring this up because there are some people I think who just like kind of take art for granted and go, oh, yeah, whatever, I'm not into it. But the economic benefits are real and they're there. Any words on that?
I do. Yeah, I can say a word on that if that's okay. But, it's not just like big blockbuster shows that bring in a lot of people and put people in hotels, but it's also, if you look across all the art institutions in this city, the performance venues, the presenters, the galleries, they're hiring a huge force of people and keeping them in the city, giving them something to do in a way to be part of the city. And so, the arts, people say, oh, don't study art or something because you won't have a job. But in fact, there's lots of different ways of being employed within the art world. And that supports a kind of economy that makes our city unique and distinctive. Like the people that kind of economy attracts are the people that make the city special, and give people a reason to come visit it and to pay attention to what's going on here. One thing the Arts Club has done recently is it's expanded a fellowship program. We've just announced our new fellows. And the goal of that is to support young emerging artists with a kind of community like Lara Caroline was talking about earlier, to give them a place to belong and a reason to stick in the city instead of, moving off to LA or New York. Chicago is an incredible place for younger makers because it's affordable. comparatively. And as Faheem was saying earlier, it has, it's not a top-heavy infrastructure. It's one in which people make their own opportunities. As soon as I got here, I could meet anybody I wanted to within the art world because it's open in that way. And so it's a very collaborative situation in which things can get done in that way. And that does drive the people willing to stay here and then participate.
I think one of the things to mention too, if I could real quick, Mark, because Janine definitely hit it on the head. I mean, there's such a huge economic system going through the arts, but it's not just within the arts that we are helping to support the economic systems in Chicago. I mean, every show we're hiring carpenters, we're hiring electricians, we're working with vinyl and printing folks from across the city. So certainly a large majority of what we're focused on is helping to support our artists and helping to support, the students that we're working with. But it's also very much about helping to keep some of those longer standing, even corporate systems open so that they can help support us as well.
I think that's it's reflected in the dedication of the artist to the city as well. I mean, I think of someone like Richard Hunt or Kerry James Marshall. These they could live wherever they want, and they're still here, sorry, Mr. Hunt, but you know what I mean. They stuck around and they made it work for them. They didn't run off to New York or LA. I just think that's a wonderful thing. Faheem, you mentioned when in our chat before we got started that you said something about art and politics, about how all arts administrators have to be politicians too. Could you expand on that just a little bit, please?
Yeah, I just it was asked, just getting to know each other, where are you from and things like that. And I said I was born here, not raised here. And I moved to North Carolina when I was born here in Chicago. And I come from a family of politicians. And now that I'm older, my mother's was a social worker. My father's a politician, state rep in North Carolina. Mother's was a social worker in Minnesota. And now I have conversations about state grants, politics, all the things that my father, when I chose to be an artist, probably didn't think these were conversations we were going to be having. But I just say that, one of the byproducts of the things that the ecosystem I talked about before is many times the artists and creatives have to wear multiple hats. And Chicago is a city of politics, and it's a very strong history of that, and it's still very present. So if you're in community space, someone's got to be wearing the politician's hat. And in my organization, Floating Museum, I'm just one of the ones that does, because of my time at Southside Community Arts Center and its community founding. Politicians were very much a part of its survival and its thriving, and as a part of that, like network. So in that same sort of way, yes, I talk with mayors and all the mayors, state reps, aldermen, you have to get to know those people on first name basis so they can really understand your motivations and that you're going to follow through on the things that, you say you're going to do. So those are like gardens that you tend, and it takes time. You have to do that. You have to do your development. So, all those things have to kind of happen and produce art at the same time, because that's kind of, I see it all as a brushstroke. I think no differently of running an arts organization than I do putting together one of my metal sculptures. So it's the same brain, same process of moving materials around, ideas around to make something happen. So yeah. Another thing I just want to just back to that other question. Often, there are layers. There's complexity to the word art, and oftentimes our brains, we like to oversimplify things so we can digest them easily. But art is just as complicated as politics, as any other or business. And oftentimes art, when we say art, it's a loaded word to many people. We say, oh, art is beauty. And that is true. Art is the thing that goes on the wall to make a home feel great, or something I look at and contemplate, or have a really heightened conversation, or make me feel elevated, drink some wine too and some cheese. But yes, those are all aspects. But also, to your point earlier, it is business. I pay a lot of money. We pay a lot of money to just on the fabrication side of things. A lot of money all over the world to do things. And you know, oftentimes we find in our field that the arts are brought in earlier, they actually help with the diversity of getting other things done. If you don't just overly simplify what it is in the way that I'm saying, even though those things aren't simple. But yeah, that's another thing, like business, like on multi-layers, just the fabrication side alone, the training that it takes to do that, the workforce development that comes with that. These are things Florida Museum is specifically focused on, its art workforce development right now as well, and building on those things versus sending those things out of the community into other parts of the country. So we're moving more into social enterprise and workforce development and training our young artists so that they don't all have to be waiters and can be closer to skills training and the things that they want to do as they're kind of matriculate out of their schools and out of their high schools and out of the city colleges as well. So
I would think, you know, I think you described yourself as growing up on the campaign trail. That probably gave you a step up in terms of speaking with politicians. I imagine a lot of artists would be like, I don't know what, we have nothing in common. What can I talk to this person about? But you can see that common ground. Very cool. You know, you also mentioned some earlier the WPA in regards to Southside Community Arts Center. And I don't know if I'm just beating a dead horse here, but I feel like I've been saying for a decade or two, like that's what we need we need a new works project. You know, we need to put people to work. I mean, you go to an old post office and you still see beautiful art and creations from 90 years ago. And I don't, not really a question there, but I'm just using the platform here to say we need a new WPA.
I mean, that's essentially what I'm talking about. WPA workforce is workforce development. You came in, you got a government job, you went out, you painted a mural in the community, you taught classes, you taught others how to do things. That's just workforce development. It's skills based. That's all it is. And you know, the art component was just one part of it, and there are many others in it. But that's essentially what I'm talking about, is the trades. I mean, I'm a welder, you know, I'm a woodworker, I'm a carpenter, a bricklayer. I'm all these things, right? Because I need to know those things in order to do the work that I want to do as well. So you just kind of take the art off of it, and then what's left is skills. And that's all I'm suggesting is our artists, yes, they're learning all these kind of high things, but they're also learning the trades. And the art is the byproduct of that. So it's just shifting our mentality. That art can actually take care of itself versus the other way around. And that's how it's often pitched, is art needs to be nurtured and cared for. When in reality, our artists are amazing. They survive and they get things done. They change neighborhoods. They're talking about urban planning. They change whole economies just, you know, by their presence.
Commerce follows art, right? You know, the artist makes a community, and then commerce follows it there for sure.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So it's just shifting the mentality a little bit. And I think the word art is just loaded. It's just programmed into us to think of a flighty, broke waiter, you know, a starving artist. It's a long kind of scheme thing, but it's not actually true.
You showed that clip earlier. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please go.
Of that show of surrealist artists that we had at the Arts Club, and I think 3 of those artists were WPA workers. So it also goes the other way. When you support artists, when you give them the minimum basic needs, then innovation follows, because they have the opportunity to do what they do as well. So it's really important.
Great answers. I'm glad I asked that question. We have a question from a viewer who says that they've noticed no return to big arts events since the pandemic. I mean, I might take issue with that. I think there's been a lot, but it's just like anything else, you know. Theaters might used to have had 8-week runs, and now they have 5-week runs. You know, things might be a little bit more limited, but do we want to address that in terms of yeah, I mean, there's some big art shows coming right up, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can say, you know, from DePaul Art Museum's perspective, we had certainly pre-pandemic, we had gotten used to having openings where we were having 500 plus people come through, which was amazing. We're not quite back to those, pre-pandemic levels yet, although we certainly are packing our exhibitions with sometimes 350, 400 people. That said, I think there's also people had a moment during the pandemic to sort of reevaluate the number of things they were doing on a regular basis. It's not that we're not offering those opportunities anymore. I think instead it's folks are kind of making different decisions about the number of things they're filling their plate up with. So I don't know if it's the case for Janine and Faheem as well, but we'll put out invitations for events, and that return in terms of the number of folks that come becomes very different. So I think there's also been a little bit of a flightiness post-pandemic in terms of like people showing up versus pre-pandemic. It was like if you said you were going to something, you're going to it. So I think there's a different mentality for everybody going into events like that.
Yeah.
I'll say that I think there's still a big audience for certain things, but it tends to be things that people know about already. And I think it's really important that the smaller institutions like the Arts Club have the freedom to maybe do something that isn't a blockbuster, because that supports critical work. It supports difficult ideas sometimes. And we're not dependent on that sort of door count in order to decide what we do. And that gives us some freedom to support artists in a different way. And I do think that we have to resist the opportunity to think that a lot of people equals success, or the only way that there can be success.
Yeah, I agree with that. I always challenge metrics. When you choose a metric with head count, if you don't achieve that, then it's considered not a successful thing. So, there's also so many other things that can happen with fewer people. But also just going back, you mentioned like after COVID, and, just philosophically, I think a lot of people thought we were on a track. Like, the idea is to get back to the thing, and in reality, we were in a tunnel. There is no going back. There are just things we discovered during COVID about our ethics. I mean, even in the job place. So once again, we're not in a test. It's not a micro verse. We roll up against other things. People aren't going back to their jobs. They're working from home. So in essence, there's no way that like we don't operate outside of those things. So even how we do an event, how we socialize, all those things kind of shift. And I do agree, if you're using the same metrics that you're using before you went in the tunnel, after the tunnel, then you're kind of already setting yourself up for perceived failure right off the jump. And the larger museums are trying to figure this out too, and having interesting conversations about inside, outside the museum and different models of how to support real estate while also being in the community. So that means you have to be flexible in your measurements and your metrics, and how things actually have impact. So I actually agree with the person. I don't think they're here anymore, but I actually agree with the person's statement. But the mention was like this notion of going back. I don't necessarily agree that will happen, even if we start doing big blockbuster things.
I see. We addressed this a little bit earlier, but I think I know the answer to the question. But I want to know about the contemporary artistic community. I mean, is it does it work together? Is it sharing? Is it supporting? Or is it dog eat dog? And I think I know the answer, but I just want to hear. I want to hear some good Chicago artist boosterism.
I think if I may, once again, kind of building on that, I think it is collaborative. I actually think if you're being overly aggressively competitive, you actually step outside the fray, and it makes it very challenging for you. Even events like Expo and big art events that are all about kind of like sales and things like that, they're going through a transition now, but they had to figure out how to tap into like how Chicago does art, and that is not exclusivity. There's a certain type of exclusivity, but ultimately people have to have the ability to approach you, collaborate with you, or at least have a conversation. If that's not done, it actually makes it kind of challenging for you to operate in the city. So I come from a space where I literally had no budget as one of the a curator of an organization. So I had to leverage my expertise, things I had access to, 80 years of art, community, artwork, in exchange for people who had funding. So there's a way we can collaborate and both benefit. And now funding institutions and foundations are actually looking for those as a winner, like a thing like if you're not collaborating, you're not going to get the dollars. During a time, there was a time when it was like people were pitted against each other when I first came in, but it just totally makes sense as a way of surviving. And all the artists you mentioned, the Harry Who, you know, all they were all kind of doing this. It's just ingrained. It's just a way of operating.
Yeah, I think of a contemporary Chicago artist named Idris Soto, who is an amazing example of, like, I met her maybe 10 years ago and she had curated a show at the Cultural Center. So she's an artist, but she was presenting all these other artists. And at the time, she told me she had chosen to be outside of the gallery system. So she's made a career kind of one-on-one. And now she has a giant project in New York City. And she kind of built her career in a very alternative way by being inclusive. She has a space, a gallery, a kind of artist-run space like Faheem was talking about earlier in her home. She's been a curator of other artists and at the same time built her own work. She was part of the Centennial at the Arts Club of Chicago and then did a project in our garden. But she kind of did it as an independent person who was bringing others along. And I think she's a remarkable example of how someone who isn't being competitive ends up succeeding even more in Chicago.
Yeah, she's awesome. She had a show last year at the Hyde Park Art Center, I think, and then this work has been at the Chicago Botanic Gardens. Love it. I have unless Laura Caroline, were you about to say something?
I was just gonna add, even from like an institutional level, I'm so thankful to be in a city where like I have meetings every other Friday with other university art museum directors. And then we're all sort of sharing and we're not thinking about resources as being this sort of limited thing that we're all competing for, but instead think about it from the perspective of like, what are the resources that we can share in order to do our work better? And I'm also, I mean, from DePaul's perspective, I am excited to be working with artists like Jem Degnan of the Stockyard Institute, who has done projects all over the city for the last 30 years, ranging from like pre-K through high school students, and engaging them with the arts from a civic perspective. So we're working with Jem to build a brand new sort of museum education platform where we're sort of rethinking what museum education means in relationship to our city, in relationship to our university, but looking at that from the artist perspective. So being able to kind of, you know, rebuild and rethink about our systems within our institutions from this incredibly collaborative artist environment that we are also working in is a real advantage for us, I think, as an institution and as a city that can kind of collaborate together.
I have a question that's sort of selfish because I'd like to know what each of you think on, you know, if you've got an open day and you want to see something. I mean, obviously there's different shows at different places, but do you have favorite go-to places that's not your institution or the one you're associated with, and whether that's, you know, the lakefront, the Block Museum, Garfield Park Conservatory, I don't know, just places you go to relax and get more inspired. Who wants to go first? We'll go alphabetical. Well, that's you, Lara.
I mean, again, Chicago is incredible for all of the spaces that it's got to offer. I am really excited. I know that Intuit has been closed for a while now, so I'm excited for their reopening over the coming year and to, you know, be able to see how they're gonna reset the way that they're talking about and thinking about their artists in their space. And I mean, certainly I can tout DePaul and the shows that we've got coming up from a Chicago perspective, but I think too, as Faheem said, and for those that are listening, I mean, there's so many kind of artist-run holes in the wall. I think Hyde Park Art Center has done an incredible job of really focusing on helping to support artist-run spaces. And so they have been through a transition themselves, and I think watching what they're going to do with those artist-run spaces over the next few years is an important aspect.
Cool. Faheem?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, a lot of kind of building on kind of Margaret Burroughs is a big inspiration for me, as well as a young person who was at the Southside Community Arts Center in the beginning and founded the DePaul Museum out of her home across the street years later. First Museum of African American History. I think kind of picking up on institution building and supporting. She didn't just found the DePaul Museum and co-founded both the DePaul Museum and Southside Community Arts Center. She also helped to found many museums. So like her guidance and her presence. So a big part of the Floating Museums model is that same type of network approach, how to support what's already there, how to work with the people doing the work, how to support the people doing the work versus trying to reinvent the wheel. So in our network, and we also curate Chicago Architecture Biennial, we try to kind of move sites through these partner organizations throughout the city as a way of like spreading resources throughout the city as well. So when I can, I like to hit those kind of, those spaces. Time is, I think some of the hesitation you hear is like, when do you have time to actually, you spend all your time kind of propping thing up. When do you actually have time to take part in the thing? So that's always a challenge. But when, I do, Urban Growers Collective in kind of Southeast and Inglewood's Arts Collective and Grow Greater Inglewood and Space Shift on Devon and, Southside Community Arts Center, of course, to name some, but also sites. Like one of the things, the reason I was going to get to is like areas. So, I'll go to an event, I'll go to a thing, but I also like to go to a neighborhood. I love going to Southeast and then kind of walking through where, the docks were and all the industry was and meeting people on the streets and things like that, or going to Inglewood. Going left when I normally go right is what I like to do. And I like when people come in town that are new to town or people, I like to drive them through my trip through Chicago. And I'm always still kind of learning that. I'll start way southeast and work my way as far as I can north before we pass out. So like moving through the city is important for me. And then I'll end up landing at some of these organizations as well. So
yeah, I love that that Steelworkers Park on the southeast side where they
that's my favorite place in Chicago.
Really? You don't feel like you're in Chicago when you're there. You're like, where am I? It's a very interesting place. Janine, where do you go for fun?
Yeah, well, what Faheem said about time resonates with me. I feel like the thing that I love to do, which everybody doesn't get to do, is studio visits with actual artists, which is a little bit of the privilege of my position. So I really there's so many great artists, and to spend time with them is really a privilege. But there is a place that kind of does sort of offer an opportunity close to that, which is the Chicago Arts Coalition, which is a really artist-driven institution where they give residencies and exhibitions and curatorial opportunities to younger artists. So I feel like that's a place that I've worked with for many years, and helped kind of do crits with them and that sort of thing. So that brings me close to artists, and that's open to the public as well. And then, my peer institutions, the Graham Foundation, the Renaissance Society, the Hyde Park Arts Center, I always try to keep up with all of them. And we do have good galleries. There's some more established ones, obviously, but smaller ones like Regards or Good Weather that are, also doing a lot of good work. So.
If I could go around the around the table one more time and just ask, you've all been so generous with your time and your wisdom. And I just want to know what's next from you, Faheem, or an organization you're working with, or, DePaul and Arts Club. So yeah, what do we have to look forward to in 2020?
Yeah. Like with my artist hat on, I'm getting ready to do an opening January 11th at the Watershed in Pilsen. It's a small kind of house gallery, really amazing space, Watershed. And then kind of with my administrator, founder, director hat on, Floating Museum, we're getting ready. We're kind of in the final stretch for fundraising for our new project space, which is all those things I said about workforce training and development will happen in this space. It's a space around practice to support artists as we deploy into the city and continue to think about the city as the museum. So find us at floatingmuseum.org, or just Google Floating Museum Chicago, and we're going to be launching our kind of building page soon. But we've been sitting on that for a little while, and we're almost there. We just need a little support to make it happen, to finish it out.
Very cool. We'll look forward to that. Laura, Caroline, I know you've got this show up through February. Somewhere I have my notes that tell me what your next is up, but please tell me.
That's right. So yeah, we've got an incredible list of programs that we'll still be doing through the rest of this show. So you can go to artmuseum.depaul.edu to check out those programs. But the next exhibitions that we have coming up for 2025, one, we're hosting a photography exhibition by Christina Fernandez called Multiple Exposures. That's coming to us from the University of California, Riverside, and is an incredible look at kind of Mexican-American identity and history here in the United States. And then in the fall, we've got very Chicago-focused shows where we are hosting an Inigo Manglano Ovale show. It's his first solo exhibition in Chicago in the last 20 years. So it'll be kind of a combination of older work, but some brand new work that he's bringing in as well. And then paired with that, we have an exhibition that's being curated by DePaul faculty named Jackie Lazou that's about the history of the Young Lords in Chicago. It's got a very deep history in Lincoln Park and with DePaul University itself. So we're excited to really kind of tackle that history within our galleries as well.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
And what's coming up, Arts
So,
Club?
Our next opening is on January 23rd. And actually, I just want to take a second to clarify that the Arts Club's exhibition program is open to the public, as are many of our performances. And so you should check out our website for that as well. So the next opening is with an artist named Cosmo White. And it is an exhibition of found journalistic images that he has repainted, and some of the images have content about protest and witnessing. And that exhibition is part of a citywide initiative instigated by the Art Institute of Chicago, who just opened an exhibition this weekend on Pan-Africa. And so Cosmo's show is sort of a point of connection to that. The Neubauer Collegium also has a show up related to Pan-Africa, and on March 7th and 8th, I believe, 6th, 7th, and 8th, there's going to be citywide lectures around the Pan-Africa exhibition at the Art Institute, and Cosmo White will be speaking at the Arts Club as part of that.
There's so much happening, and this is just, three of you, we could time this by 1,000 because it just goes so deep, and it's really worth exploring. There's so much to see and do in this town. We all know that, but we need to do it and see it. So I want to thank our guests so much for your generosity and your time. Janine Mileaf, Executive Director and Curator of the Arts Club of Chicago, and Faheem Majeed, Artist Curator, multi-hyphenate, and Laura Caroline DeLaura. Again, I really appreciate it, and I'm wishing you a happy holidays. Let's have a happy new year too. Can we do that? I think we can. Let's try. Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.